My name is Sean Baker, and I'm a Christian Reformed pastor who works as a ministry consultant for Pastor Church Resources. And as part of my work, I'm routinely invited to walk alongside pastors and churches that are experiencing challenging seasons of transition, conflict, or discernment. And for many of our churches, this season right now, after Synod, is one of those challenging seasons. Anxiety is high. In June 2022, Synod made a series of decisions about the denomination's teaching about human sexuality and the confessional status of that teaching. And many churches and individuals are trying to sort out just what exactly those decisions mean. Some churches basically agree with Synod's decision, but they're still feeling overwhelmed by the practical and pastoral challenge of living into this vision well. The human sexuality report was clear that our track record overall in this area is not good as a denomination. For other churches, these decisions, well, frankly, they feel like an imposition. Now, members and ministry leaders are asking whether they can remain a part of a congregation with which they might disagree on this issue. Meanwhile, many churches are wondering just how much difference in belief with each other can we live with, and how will we live with that difference? Now, the problem for churches in anxious moments like these is that our natural responses to anxiety are usually not very helpful. When we get anxious, we start to see the world in, well, simplistic ways, black and white, good and bad. We feel like we have to pick a side, and we feel like there's really only two sides. We start to attribute all kinds of nasty motives to the people with whom we disagree. In the end, our capacity for creativity is really diminished, and our ability to love is really strained. Leaders especially have a hard time in anxious moments. On the one hand, we maybe hope these issues will just go away on their own. And on the other hand, we maybe feel tempted to maybe force some resolution just to relieve the stress we're feeling. At Pastor Church Resources, we often see anxious churches struggle with decisions in really three ways. First, they rush the decision. Without really considering the consequences of the decision, they rush it. Second, they hush important voices. They don't really listen deeply or well to the voices they most need to hear. So we're not really listening to God's voice, for instance. And we're not intentional about hearing the voices of those who are really most affected by this decision. And third, we start cutting corners in the decision-making process itself. The process becomes mush. It is unclear who has the authority to decide. It is unclear when or how or if people in the congregation will have an opportunity to speak into the decision or discernment. It's unclear even just what the decision means. And the impact of rush, hush, and mush on a congregation is it tends to diminish trust. It sows confusion and it builds up frustration even among those people who basically agree with whatever decision is ultimately made. Now, the question we're asking at Pastor Church Resources is, what if it didn't need to be this way? What if the anxiety of this moment were not a distraction from your church's discipleship, but what if this tension was actually an opportunity for making better disciples? I mean, after all, aren't most of the instructions we have about Christian discipleship in the New Testament written in the form of letters to first century congregations experiencing conflict and tension? I mean, maybe it is moments like these that we actually grow most as disciples. What if the way you handled these differences together wasn't an obstacle to your witness to the community, but what if you could handle your differences in a way that witnessed to this polarized and dysfunctional world the power of God in your midst? What if this is precisely the moment where our Christian living is most powerful? What if God knew that it would be hard to bear with one another and submit to one another and be kind and compassionate to one another? What if the commands to Christians that, fill the New Testament, what if they're not for after the conflict subsided and after our differences disappeared, but what if they were intended for during the conflict and while the differences persisted? What if God used challenging seasons like these to actually deepen our dependence on Him and build up our capacity to have the same mindset as Christ Jesus? What if there was a way to love each other well, even if we still come to the conclusion that we can't stay together as we once were? What if we could hear not just the most sort of strident and polarized voices in our midst, but also all those voices in between? And what if we acted as though God's voice really was the voice we most needed to hear and follow? I know it sounds idealistic, and maybe you're thinking, this will never work. But in Ephesians 4, the Apostle Paul pleads with the church. He says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. And now, I don't know, maybe it is unrealistic to make every effort, but I don't know, can we make some effort? I mean, is this perhaps the season for making an effort in your church to see this, maybe impossible situation through the eyes of faith? At Pastor Church Resources, we developed Next Steps Discernment to make an effort to see what would happen if at this anxious moment we leaned not into our worst fears, but into our faith. What does it look like practically? Next Steps Discernment provides a series of structured and facilitated listening circles for church members and church leaders to listen deeply to one another as the council discerns what, if any, next steps God is inviting the church to consider. Throughout the process, your church will be sustained by spiritual disciplines, and that will help keep you more connected to Christ. And you'll also be constantly prompted to practice that most basic Christian command to love one another. And you'll love one another personally by listening, and you'll love one another as leaders by following good process. Now, I don't expect that this discernment process will make your differences and disagreements just magically go away. I won't guarantee you'll stay together. I'm not promising happy outcomes, but I think this process does give you a chance to make an effort, to lean into the challenge of this moment in a way that takes God at His word. That He's not with us just after the dark valley, but He's with us in the valley. That He's not given us each other for when everything is easy, but He's given us each other for when things are hard. And that for those who trust in Him, even seasons in the wilderness are never wasted. To learn more about how your church can use Next Steps Discernment for the anxious season you find yourself in, check us out at crcna.org/PCR/nextsteps.